specifically in the Lowcountry, oysters is a good means of bringing the community together?
Absolutely, it is. It is one of the best means because it's one of those unique experiences that you can only really have in a genuine way in the Lowcountry. Sure.
Oysters play an important role in the history, culture, and ecosystem in the Lowcountry. If you've spent any time in Beaufort County, you've probably had interactions with oysters. They are commonplace in our rivers, marshes, and estuaries, as well as on the menus of our local restaurants. To find out more about oysters, like how they function in the environment, the role they play in culture, their importance in pre-colonial civilizations, and the status of our local populations, we've talked to many different people, such as scientists, historians, cultural leaders, aquaculturists, and local restaurant owners to find out more.
Back in the 20s, during Prohibition, oystering was really the economy on Hilton. I mean, there was no bridge, there was no tourism.
What role do you think that plays, like, do oysters play in the culture of the Lowcountry, and like how has the dependence of oysters like changed the culture down here?
Well, I tell you what, it really made us different from other places because other people had probably other things that they could depend on. We only had the river where we got not only oysters now, we got clams, we got conch, with different fish, and we had a variety of fish in our waters here, and shrimp and all that. So we had a variety of foods. So all this hunger and all this stuff, we were never hungry on Hilton Head. Never. Okay, so oysters was definitely a way of life, living, money making kind of thing here for our people on Hilton Head Island.
Back in that time, we would come in here early before the sun came up in the morning, and they moored oar-powered skiffs known as bateaus, and they'd row out to the oyster grounds, and they'd harvest oysters all day, and then they'd bring them back into the shed, which was a part of the dock at the time, and a lot of their family members would shuck the oysters. Then the oyster meat would get packed in steel-belted barrels, and it would, with ice, and it would get barged up to Charleston, and then ultimately distributed to Boston, New York, and Chicago, as oysters were extremely popular at that time in history.
They depend on the tide because they had to go in at the right tide when the tide was going down so those oyster banks could be exposed, that they could get the oysters. And I brought this thing that they call a grab because the oyster pickers back then, they would need something like this to grab those clusters of oysters off the bank and throw it in the boat. Okay? And on Hilton Head Island, you had probably about 4 or 5 oyster factories right here on Hilton Head. Okay? And the men would go out with the battles and they would bring the oysters back to the factory, wash them, take a wheelbarrow and roll them into the factory, and the women would be the shuckers. They were the one that opened the oysters. They had this tall stainless steel pail that they would put those oysters in. And at the end of the week, when the oysters are sold, then the money was split between the oyster pickers and the shuckers. So that's how people actually lived. That's how they got paid. It's a paid job for them. And then the guys who went out crabbing, they had crab traps and stuff. They used those same battles to do the same thing, okay? Or the guys that went out and got shrimp to sell around in the community. And that's before the shrimp boat come in. Well, this seafood thing is big here on these islands.
We can see that oysters have embedded themselves into the coastal culture, from a way of making a living to bringing the community together. But this isn't a new phenomenon. This can be traced back to Native American settlements. This can be seen through shell rings that give us insight into just how intertwined oysters and humans are. To better understand the relationship, we talked to an expert on Paleo-Indian culture and shell rings.
One really interesting thing about the shell rings and the people that were living there is even though they were there for 1,000 years or more, living off of a lot of shellfish, we track the size of the shellfish over time, which can give you an idea of how stressed the shellfish are. And they're not very stressed, even after people have been eating off of them for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, which really suggests to us that the native peoples weren't just going out there and gathering it, but they were probably cultivating oysters and clams. They probably were being very careful not to over-harvest, and had a very kind of forward-minded idea of how to protect these really critical resources. Shell rings are an archaeological feature. That's what we describe them as archaeologists. They're these large circular or arcing deposits of shellfish, mostly oysters and clams, that usually encircle a broad, open space that we often describe as a plaza. They're all roughly about the same age, somewhere between 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, all made by Native Americans. So there's spread out over 2,000 years and over a couple of thousand miles of coastline. There's probably a lot of different stories about how they came to be. Most of what we understand them being used for is a combination of being both places of living. So some of them are described as early villages, some of the first places where Native Americans ever lived year-round and over multiple generations. And then others, especially really remarkably large ones, are often thought to have more of a ceremonial function, be a place where people would gather and have large events and feasts and various types of ceremonies. Our research is really strongly suggesting that almost all of the rings that we look at were village sites that probably had intermittent gatherings at them, and that there's very few, if any, sites that were purely for ceremony. The one or two sites that look like were mostly for ceremony look like they started as villages, and then after a certain time, people left them as villages, created a new ring, and then used the old ring as more of a ceremonial site.
It's impressive the impact oysters have had on people living near the coast for thousands of years. The native culture still has a lasting legacy to this day. Multiple towns and rivers in this area are still named after their tribes and their languages, such as Yamasee and Cheehaw. Moving away from the past, we wanted to look at how these creatures live and what role they play in the ecosystem. To find this answer, we sat down with some local scientists like Chris Kerr, the naturalist at the Port Royal Sound Foundation, Julie Davis, who manages the Ladies Island Oyster Farm, and Jean Frew with the Outside Foundation. The South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement Program, also known as SCORE, also had some great things to say about the importance of oysters and their impact on the environment.
So if the worst happens, right, and we go on a route where oyster reefs start to decline, right, what effect do you think the decrease in oyster reef population has on the ecosystem of the Lowcountry?
Yeah, so we're calling them oyster reefs, right? They are the reef system in our estuarine environment. This is where animals are coming to seek refuge, whether it's during the low tide. We do an activity here where we pull oyster bags out of the water and look through them, and you can find an array of animals in them, even during a low tide event, right? So mud crabs, polychaete worms, we've found eels and a variety of other species in them. But then at high tide, right, when the water is consuming them, you're finding things like mud minnows, red drum, black drum, stone crabs, blue crabs that are surrounding them for food resources or, again, refugia. So critically important just for the environment. But then, we go back to our previous discussion talking about water quality. Taking these animals out obviously is going to have direct impacts on water quality on top of not allowing for habitat to be there. So pretty important if we were to lose that species.
So we, in our conservation class currently, we've been learning this term called ecosystem engineer, right? So would you say oysters are huge in the aspect where they make homes and make sediment for other creatures to live in?
Yeah, so ecosystem engineers are one of the species that are considered to be keystone species, right? So that's one of the pollinators and apex predators, and then ecosystem engineers being one of those keystone species. So yeah, absolutely. Without them, it would have major ecosystem collapses. I think you see that. There are examples of that in the United States when you look at Chesapeake Bay and the work that they're doing to come back from major losses in oysters now. So there's examples out there that show that loss of oysters shows loss of diversity in that area.
Going back to the oyster farming, do you, make your own larvae, or do you buy it? Like, do you conserve your own larvae?
We produce all of our own seed. We have a hatchery where we spawn the oysters, and so we do all of that ourselves. So we will collect broodstock, so the moms and the dads will collect 100 or so of those from out in the wild. It is, yep. And so it's all done in a confined setting so that we can, increase our success rate from a small number of animals. In the wild, only about 1% of the larvae produced from a cross, so from a mating of a male and a female, only about 1% of those will survive to be an adult oyster, and so we just increase those odds by having that process happen within the hatchery. So everything we do is with local stock, and so that's how we do produce our seed.
We live here in what's called a larval-rich substrate poor environment. And what that means is that as our oysters spawn during the warm months of late spring and through the summer, there's not a whole lot for those babies to attach to, and larval oysters require a hard surface as substrate. And it just so happens that the most perfect substrate for them is another oyster shell.
So what is SCORE's project and its overarching goal, and why did South Carolina feel the need to start up this project?
Well, the SCORE program, which is the South Carolina Oyster Recycling and Enhancement Program, is based in Charleston, South Carolina, with the main offices of the Department of Natural Resources. And many years ago, it became apparent that we had a critical shortage of this very important substrate along our coastline. Oysters are a keystone species within our environment, so they're critically important in that they support the top three things within our seafood industry: fish, crab, and shrimp. And so because of that, and because of the need for substrate in our environment, the collecting of oyster shells, recycling of them, and putting them back out into the ecosystem is critical. A dramatic increase in development along our coastline. And so if you followed along recently in the news, you know that the so-called headwaters, the very end of the May River, is a critical area in terms of stormwater runoff and has been shut down for oystering.
Where do you get most of your oyster?
Well, we actually have an aquaculture operation where we have about 350,000 single select oysters growing. We have two oystermen that work with us to provide us with our cluster oysters for oyster roast and for steaming. We do buy some gallons of oysters from Larry Toomer at Bluffton Oyster Company. He's one of the very few shucking houses left in South Carolina, believe it or not. And then I have a dear friend in Chincoteague Island, Virginia, named Mike McGee. He's spent his whole life since he was a teenager collecting oyster leases in that area, and he now owns the rights to about 70% of the wild oyster beds in Chincoteague Island. He's 86, and he provides us with a lot of the gallon oysters that we use for frying, because our oysters here, because of the climate, they don't plump up until like February, and then the season goes out for those in the middle or end of April. So we have a very short window where our oysters are plump enough to serve for fried oysters, because they shrink up really bad and you end up with a little piece of oyster hanging on the plate, and our customers tend to shy away from that. So we supplement with oysters from Chincoteague Island unless they're not as good as beautiful oyster. I think aquaculture is going to be on the rise, and I think what most people don't realize about aquaculture with regards to oysters, are these oysters farm raised? I say, well, yeah, but that kind of has a negative connotation, because what we're doing essentially is creating a baby oyster in a hatchery, and then that oyster gets put out in the wild, and it lives its entire life in the same environment, eating the same food that a wild oyster would eat. So there's very little difference in flavor profile or health benefits. So it's really a misnomer to say farm raised, because it's not the same as it's not like we're feeding them something. Like think about salmon being farmed, they're feeding them high protein feed and stuff like that. Well, and some salmon that's farmed is really delicious, but I think people will get a little confused. These oysters that we're farming are eating algae that occurs naturally in the wild, and that's how it's a point of difference from fish farming.
How long does it take for you to go from seeding your oyster?
So from the time I spawn the oysters
to
to the time you're ready to eat them is about 12 to 16 months.
As we have learned, oyster populations are declining due to many different factors. These issues are complex, and it will require collaborative effort between stakeholders and the public to mitigate these problems and improve and enhance oyster habitat.
A big hindrance to the population for a long time was due to a lack of education. Through oystering, through generations, the oystermen themselves were doing nothing to put oysters back. There was no conservation work, it was just taking oysters. I think they have stats out there that show only like 10% of the oysters taken out of South Carolina are actually recycled. So you're taking out the mechanism or the substrate, I could say, that these animals are attaching to. These oysters need a hard substrate to settle on, and most often they're settling on each other. That's why our oysters cluster. So not putting those oyster shell back into the environment gives them no place to resettle. So you're inhibiting these oysters from creating reefs, new reefs. So that's a big one, is just recycling your shell, making sure that, if you are taking shell out, that you're putting it back in.
So if you've been out in our creeks and waterways, you know that we have a lot of soft mud and grass, and not a whole lot of hard substrate. So by putting that shell back out there, we can replenish oysters for commercial harvesting as well as for environmental reasons.
For citizens that aren't local and aren't attending these events, is there a way that they could get or help with the SCORES program?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
If so, how?
Sure, you can go on the SCDNR's website and just click on the left column. It's the SCORE program. It'll tell you all about that. It shows you where the drop-off sites are. So let's say you're having a backyard roast, or your community is having a roast, or University of South Carolina, Beaufort is having a roast. I just saw a little flyer for that. You can throw all of that in a bucket, and you can find your closest location, which for you all would be Trask. And on any given day, you can head on out there and just throw your shell on the pile and know that that shell will be gathered up and will be used. Coastal Conservation, I think, is the group that will do most of the removal of the shell there. So sure, that's I think definitely a way that people can be involved.
To finish off, can you just talk a little bit more about the process of recycling the oyster shell?
Yeah, so if you see, well, you guys probably can't see, but right to the right of us, we have all of the oyster shell that are consumed in the restaurant. They get distributed out on this sort of sunny spot on the northeast corner of the restaurant. And what those oysters will ultimately be distributed back out into the wild on our oyster leases. And what happens is that creates habitat for wild oysters when they reproduce. When the wild oysters reproduce, the larval oyster has to attach to a hard object. And unfortunately, here, a lot of places where you go, like Chickadee Island, for example, you have a layer of silt, which is a really thin organic material on the bottom, and it's about that thick. And it's very not very dense. And then you have bedrock underneath. So when a larval oyster goes to set, they sink down through that silt and attach to that bedrock. Well, here we have like feet of fluff mud. And so the oyster can't settle through fluff mud because it would suffocate. So in order for us to keep a healthy wild oyster population, it is super important that we recycle our oyster shells and distribute them back into the wild. Actually, Gene Frew with the Outside Foundation does a lot of work for that, and I've gone on some of the builds with her. It's pretty cool, but the work they're doing is super important, but I don't think people realize how much of that work needs to be done, or how much more of that work needs to be done to make a lasting impact. They're doing, I think I want to say a couple dozen builds a year. That is such a small part of the estuary environment that we have. It would be great if more people would do it and more people would take it into their hands. We're not bagging the oysters that we take out and put on our lease. All we're doing is distributing them. And what other thing people don't realize is that if you put those oysters out at the wrong time of year, and then they get scum and slime all over them and mud all over them, the likelihood of them creating habitat is diminished greatly. So it's super important to put them out somewhere in that June to August time frame when those wild oysters are reproducing.
We're located in the Seabrook section of Beaufort County, South Carolina. We are the oldest oyster farm in the state. We're also the only oyster farm that does the entire process from beginning to end. So we have a hatchery, a nursery, and a full grow out operation in Coosaw River, and all our own distribution and marketing to restaurants. Our oysters are supplied to restaurants in Savannah, Hilton Head, Bluffton, Charleston, Mount Pleasant, Sullivan's Island. So all up and down, all up and down the coast there at the Lowcountry, you can find our oysters.
You farm the oysters. Do you think one day farming oysters will become more of a priority than naturally harvested oysters?
100%.
Yeah.
It's already happening. I mean, South Carolina's a little bit behind the curve on kind of permitting and permitting what I would say are new technologies. Technology is a bad word because people assume electronics, but there's a lot of farms up north and on the West Coast that are using new best practices and are able to farm oysters much, much more efficiently than they were 10 years ago. And so I think the majority, I would be surprised if it's not already getting there, where the majority of the live oysters in the shell are a function of aquaculture operations. And I think you're going to see that ring true with not just oysters, but a lot of different aquatic species. Because I don't think that the wild population of finfish and shellfish can sustain the population growth.
Do you think SCORE or SCDNR taking like a community-based approach has been impactful in achieving these results?
I think the community-based approach, and we're a grassroots, very community-oriented nonprofit, I think it's the only way. We have a critical shortage of recycled shell in our state, so we need to make sure that everybody knows about that. If we're sending shell to the landfill, we're actually creating or supporting the problem of shortage, but we're also creating a landfill, which at some point will become overfilled and capped off, and where do we put the next one? So the importance of recognizing shell as a natural resource is very community-based. And I think one of the best ways to learn, one of the ways in which I learn, has always been doing. And so the Outside Foundation, as an extension, a community extension of the SCORE program, we give opportunities for community members of all ages to actually get their hands dirty, to actually be involved. And if they're not directly involved in bagging or in the process of building the reef, then they can be involved in encouraging our local restaurants to collect shell. so that they don't throw it out. So we have upwards of, I think about 18 restaurants right now between Hilton Head and Bluffton that are on the loop for getting their shell collected. We're also capturing at the different festivals. Every time we go to the festivals, whether it's Hilton Head or Beaufort, we have a chance to actually, face-to-face interact with people and to talk about the importance of recycled shell. And so it's really a captive audience. They're enjoying the oysters, they understand, but they may not understand the value of the shell when they're done enjoying that oyster. So absolutely, I think all environmental-based change, I think, starts at the community level. And the original grant we had for this program came from Patagonia, and the CEO of Patagonia really got started in terms of his environmental action by realizing that change begins at the community level.
Oysters are very important to our community and to our waterways. They truly are an essential part of the Lowcountry. As we've talked about and learned, they play a vital role in filtering water, helping with coastal erosion, providing a stable food source, bringing the community together, and so much more. As we have learned, oyster populations are declining due to many factors. These issues are complex, and it will require a collaborative effort between stakeholders and the public to mitigate these problems and to improve and enhance oyster habitat.